Hi, everyone. We are going to read chapters 19, 20, and 21. Are you ready? Here we go. Chapter 19, The Shock on the Stairs. After their visit with Mrs. Sharp, the news about Frog, Petra, and Calder couldn't wait to get back to the search. The only remaining part of the university school compound that had paneling was King Hall. The middle school and the high school buildings were too new, and Poppyfield Hall had been carved up into studio and theater spaces. Don't forget, there's a map of the school in the front of the book. Used only for college classes and offices, King Hall was practically empty after school. Starting on the first floor, Petra and Calder worked their way upstairs. There seemed to be miles of dark wood. Leaving the lights out, they ran their hands along the square wall panels in lecture rooms, tapping softly and looking for hidden compartments. They opened closets and cupboards, but all were empty. The building seemed discouragingly solid. This place is dead compared with Delia Dell, Calder said, looking out at the bright building across the street. Completed in 1916, Delia Dell Hall boasted countless gargoyles and faces half hidden in decades of ivy. There were stone turrets, an assortment of chimneys, and casement windows. In addition to the original rooms, it had a pool, a pub, and a modern movie theater. Parties and performances were held there. The building cast a warm yellow glow on the snow, a glow that sent fingers of light into the dark classrooms of King. So much for my U for the U school. Sorry, I'll read that again. So much for my U for the U school pentomino idea, Petra said, standing next to Calder at the window. Guess she's not here. How about a quick look in Delia Dell before we go home? Sure, plus we can get M&Ms there, and I'm starving. Their voices faded into the early darkness as they headed across the street, leaving the quiet of King Hall to resettle behind them. Calder and Petra sat on a long bench on the first floor in Delia Dell, sharing blue ones and a bag of potato chips. Snow was falling, magically, softening and erasing the university world beneath it. They piled jackets and hats and gloves into a damp mound beside them. Several college students on the other side of the room were talking about a Latin class. A man with heavy eyebrows sat reading a newspaper. A professor with a head like a pink bowling ball hurried in the direction of the pool, towel under his arm. A woman carrying a giant ring of keys passed their bench and headed up the stairs. Calder could hear the sharp click of a door opening and a thunk of a lock sliding into place from inside. Petra didn't seem to notice any of this. She was eating steadily, looking straight ahead of her with a sleepy expression. Calder was feeling talkative. Wow, this whole place is wood. Look at that staircase. I've never really noticed it before. It looks like something from an old movie. You know, like Betty Davis should be standing at the top. Right. Petra stood up and stretched. Come on, it's getting late. Away from the entrance hall, they wandered through room after empty room of paneled wood, stone fireplaces, tiled floors. They stayed in the older parts of the building. Neither had realized how big the original part of Delia Dell Hall was. It twisted and turned gracefully, a rectangular dance with surprises in scale and mood. One moment it was grand, the next cozy. There was a huge ballroom space on the first floor with a Tai Chi class going on in one corner. Across the way was a miniature reception room followed by what looked like a dining room. Plaster grapevines covered the heavy beams overhead, and the walls, paneled in rectangles of varying sizes, were interrupted here and there by almost invisible doors. A small wooden knob and a keyhole were the only indications that something might be up. One door led to an old-fashioned kitchen, one to a black staircase, and 3 or 4 others were simply locked. The dining area opened up into a sunny library with a generous fireplace. Over the mantel, a wooden scroll read, dedicated to the life of women at the University of Chicago. Carved lions and horses flanked the dedication. Petra stood in front of it, admiring the elaborate Gothic letters. Cool. I wonder what that means. My mom told me this was the first place at the university where women students could hang out. Anyway, Calder said, let's keep going. On the second floor, there were some offices and 3 empty lecture rooms, all with rows of wooden chairs, old oil paintings on the walls, and elaborate leaded glass windows. The third floor had a miniature theater. The walls of the room facing the theater were covered with a parade of young people in medieval costumes, dancing, playing, and talking with one another in an idyllic country setting. I butchered that. The north wall had vaulted windows with French doors that opened onto a roof terrace. Petra and Calder stood awed at the entrance to the room. A red velvet curtain covered the stage, and on either side was a small wooden door. Propelled by the same urge, they walked slowly toward the stage. There was no one in sight. Without a word, Calder tried the door on the right-hand side. It opened. 3 short steps led up to a tiny backstage area. They crept inside, stepping over frayed curtain ropes, a lute with no strings, a plastic pitcher, and an old broom. These look like props from a goofy Vermeer, Calder said. He thought Petra would smile, but she didn't seem to be listening. Not much place to hide, was all she said. Petra suddenly felt as though she had forgotten something important, or as if she was supposed to be someplace, but couldn't quite remember where. Or maybe it was that she didn't feel well. It wasn't an effort to talk. Back on the second floor, she wandered over to a window seat and sat down. Being next to a casement window felt oddly comforting. Calder was down on all fours, looking up into the fireplace. I'm just checking for hidden shelves. This building could be filled with secrets we haven't ever imagined, even imagined. Hearing no response, he peered around her. What's the matter? You look like you're half asleep. Calder, these windows. Calder sat up. Yeah, he said slowly, kind of like Vermeer windows. Petra looked around the room. And the paneled wood. I mean, millions of old buildings have paneled wood, but these rectangles. Petra's voice trailed off, and she stared at her reflection in the darkening glass. So we have an image right here on page 195, and Petra is walking down the stairs, and there's all kinds of intricate detail inside of the staircase. I see 2 frogs in the staircase, one on the bottom section, one right here, and I see one right here. So that's 2 frogs. But now we need to find the pentominoes. There might be more frogs, of course, but I haven't found them. Oh, I see one in the window. The one that kind of looks like a plus sign. I think it's a T. Right here, like shadowed. I'm going to put a Post-it note there so I know to come back. Now I'll write that down on my paper. All right. Calder came over and sat down quietly next to her. Do you want to look around some more? He asked, sounding like his parents when they were trying to get him to do something, but didn't want to be too obvious. Petra looked steadily at him. Calder, what are you thinking? That you sound like we might be getting warm. Petra was suddenly feeling horribly warm. I might just be getting sick. Come on, let's get out of here. He headed back to the first floor. They passed the weasels that became brass door handles, the carved flute player ahead, the stone lions mounted high above the landing. Petra resting her hand on the railing as they walked slowly down the sweeping staircase, stopped with a jolt. Calder kept going. I guess that's what's in the picture. The railings were a delicate tangle of iron grapevines and creatures. There were birds, mice, and lizards. Instead of newel posts at the bottom of the staircase, an intricately carved oak monkey clung to either end of the railing. Monkey, panel, vines, flute, vines. She could feel the blood beating wildly in her temples. Monkey, vines, panel, flute, vines, vines. Mrs. Sharp's words. Remember when they were at the hospital and Mrs. Sharp was playing with the pentominoes and she made a word game? So those are the words that Miss Sharp was saying. Miss Sharp's words. Petra stood frozen, one hand gripping the railing. She saw Calder pawing obviously through their soggy clothing for his jacket. She hoped her face wasn't revealing her wild, screaming thoughts. Walk, just walk normally. A man looked up at her as she passed, putting down his paper. Was the world able to feel her heart pounding, her thoughts on fire? She grabbed her things and burst out the door into the merciful dusk. Petra, what's up? Come on! Calder could hardly keep up with his friend as she half ran, half stumbled through the new snow. She hurried a block east on 59th Street and glanced back. Calder looked back too, suddenly frightened. Let's go home through backyards. We need to disappear, okay? Calder walked quietly next to Petra, their shoulders touching. He thought of the P for pray, or was it pray? The blue shadows of late afternoon were menacing now. Bushes between houses seemed filled with pools of darkness, and people hunched against the cold looked dangerous. When she was satisfied they weren't being followed, Petra stopped. Calder, this is it. He looked around at the deserted alleyway and shivered. This is what? I think we found her. Chapter 20, A Maniac. As Petra brushed her teeth that night, she went over what had happened in Delia Dell Hall. There had been a clear zap in her mind. It reminded her of the time she'd been plugging a frayed lamp cord into a wall and her finger had landed on a bare wire. Had Mrs. Sharp let something slip? Was she hoping they'd pick up on her clues? Petra thought of what Miss Hussey had once said about criminals wanting to be discovered. If Mrs. Sharp and Miss Hussey had been collaborating, and then, as if someone had changed the prescription on her glasses, she suddenly saw how wild her ideas had gotten. Were she and Calder crazy to think that those two women could be mixed up in the theft? Their suspicions about the neighbor and their teacher suddenly seemed overwrought and childish. How could this staircase experience be anything but a huge, strange coincidence? First of all, she and Calder and Mrs. Sharp had been playing a game with pentominoes. Mrs. Sharp obviously had never seen a pentomino before. The words she had made up that afternoon were not something she had planned. Secondly, she was an old lady. She was the widow of a murder victim. Had she gotten a letter from the thief? After weeks of worrying, she had turned it in. She had asked for police protection, and Mrs. Hussey was a young teacher and a dedicated one. Why would she ever get mixed up in a major art theft? Petra tapped her toothbrush on the sink in a businesslike way. Her imagination had run with her in Delia Hall, hoping to get the mystery solved, but she had jumped into some ridiculous conclusions. All this looking was making her crazy. The zap was probably from not feeling well, and Mrs. Sharp's pentomino words were nothing more than a magnificent Charles Fort incident. The stolen painting was probably in Switzerland or Brazil or Japan. She'd apologized to Calder in the morning for scaring him. In 2 days, it would be her 12th birthday. 12-year-olds were old enough to sort out what made sense and what didn't. Petra put down her toothbrush and, sitting on the edge of the bathtub, waited for the water to get hot. She suddenly thought about the lady. Am I thinking clearly? She wanted to ask her. Did I just imagine what happened today? Are you and Delia Dell? She waited for a response. There wasn't one. Doubt seeped back into her mind. Since when had she been so rational, imagining that was what she was best at? And hadn't she and Calder agreed that they needed to rescue Miss Hussey? And how about the letters she had just found in Mrs. Sharp's bushes? She hopped into the tub and put a hot washcloth on her head. Letting her neck flop backward, she closed her eyes. Suddenly, she found herself picturing a rectangle inside a triangle. It was more of a feeling than an image. She dunked her head, letting the water run into her ears. Couldn't she stop thinking? It was a sparkling, whiter than white winter morning, a morning of brusque sky, inky black branches, and the blinding two-dimensional look of new snow. Glancing out her window as she dressed, Petra thought that the branches could be rivers on a map or cracks on a blue plate. Maybe they were symbols in an unknown code. How do we know that trees don't talk deliberately with their branches, giving slow, intricate messages with an unnoticed vocabulary of shapes? Calder's thinking was infectious. Whistling happily, Petra flew down the stairs to breakfast. The world felt rich with possibility. Her practical reasoning last night now seemed cowardly, unimaginative. What had gotten into her? She thought of the thief's phrase, "I congratulate you on your pursuit of the truth." It was Saturday morning, and her parents, still in pajamas, their heads almost touching, were absorbed in an article in the Chicago Tribune. They looked upset. The guy is a maniac, a self-absorbed lunatic. Petra's father slammed his hand against the table. All the cereal bowls jumped. What's wrong? Petra froze. More news on the Vermeer painting. We'll all have to pray that the FBI knows what they're doing. Frank Andalese stood up as he spoke, putting a hand on his daughter's shoulder. Aren't you glad you aren't responsible for saving one of the world's masterpieces from a maniac? So we have an image here, or an illustration on page 202, and we know that there's not going to be any codes in it, but we see Petra looking concerned, right? Her brow is furrowed as she's looking in the newspaper, and it shows the front of it, right? Chicago Tribune is what it's called, so you see the CHI for Chicago. Yeah, Dad, her heart sinking, she began to read. The National Gallery of Art received the following anonymous letter yesterday. The last communication from the thief, an advertisement sent to the Chicago Tribune, had been mailed from Florence, Italy. The letter received yesterday was mailed from a post office in Washington, D.C. Both the FBI and the National Gallery of Art felt it was important that the public know immediately about the thief's latest intentions. Dear National Gallery, the recent released book, The Vermeer Dilemma, What Happens Now, points to the public's overwhelming response to my letter and the 3 advertisements I took out in the newspapers around the world. They have indeed come to agree with me. Now it is up to you and your colleagues to agree publicly with us all. That's a funny word. I demand that you write letters to all other owners of Vermeer paintings. You are to state that my point of view is a valid one, and to request that the attributions that I identified earlier be changed immediately. If these attributions are not changed within 1 month, by January 11th, I will, against my desires, destroy A Lady Writing. I will consider it a sacrifice in the interest of truth, a lesson for those too rigid, too dishonest to do what is right. I am old and will not live long. I will, however, live to see this resolved on museum walls and in writing, or, to the horror of us all, in ashes. I beg you to spare A Lady Writing. If you look into your hearts, I know that you will, as I predicted in November, come to agree with me. Do what is right. Petra dropped the paper and rushed out of the kitchen. Chapter 21, Looking and Seeing. The thief is way more ruthless than we thought. It was 9 a.m. and Calder and Petra were sitting in Calder's kitchen drinking hot chocolate. His parents were out grocery shopping. I'll bet if we were calling the police, the Liadell would be searched today. And if the painting is there, they'd have a better chance of finding it than we would. The other thing we can do is tell our parents and leave it up to them. Petra didn't sound particularly happy about either idea. Calder, absorbed in his own thoughts, grinned. We can also tell no one. I can see the headlines now. Kids locate missing Vermeer, or kids brilliantly track down Vermeer masterpiece, or kids league discouraged FBI agents to Calder, come on. How can you even think about fame? What would be best for the lady? Petra closed her mouth in a tight, big sister kind of line. To be found. Calder folded his arms across his chest and looked sulky. You'd like to be on the news too. Petra paused to think about seeing herself on a talk show or having her picture on the front of the Chicago Tribune. Maybe, she said in a kinder voice. I vote we try to find it ourselves today, and if we don't, we talk to our parents and the police tonight. Fine. I think we should call Mrs. Sharp first. Why? Calder had pulled the I pentomino out of his pocket and was flipping it back and forth on the table. Because the letter sounds like her talking. We know it's not. She's in the hospital, and besides, she would never harm a Vermeer. She might help us. Petra gave her mug a decisive tap with her spoon. We'll tell her what had happened in Delia Dell. That will make her curious. Then, if she knows something, maybe she'll just blurt it out. Both were looking at the eye. What is it saying? Petra asked. Instant, Calder said. Guess that means get going. They called the hospital and asked for Mrs. Sharp's room. When she answered, Petra said, Calder and I were spending some time in Delia Dell yesterday. And? Mrs. Sharp's voice could have cut steel. The letter in the newspaper, we're worried. There was silence on the other end. Mrs. Sharp, we just didn't want you to worry about us. Don't flatter yourselves. Why should I worry? Before Petra could tell her about the zap on the staircase, the old woman said, just be careful. Looking and seeing are two very different things. The phone line went dead. Calder left his parents a note. He and Petra put on their coats and headed for the campus. They hurried in through the side door of Delia Dell, and Petra skidded on the wet floor tiles. Her feet went out from under her, and she came into a painful stop in front of one of the benches. Scrambling to her knees, she looked up into a man's face. He had eyebrows so thick that they hung precariously over his eyes, which seemed far too small for the size of his face. Slippery stuff, is it not? Slippery stuff, is it not? The man's voice was low and pleasant. He had a foreign accent. These old floors are terrible when they are wet. But it's a wonderful building, very wonderful. He smiled at Petra, his eyes almost vanishing beneath the outcropping of hair. He offered her a large hand. You two were visiting their other day, no? Something about this man was familiar. Petra was on her feet. I'm fine, she blurted, and shoved Calder back out of the door in front of her. Great, now that man noticed us, and you acted all nervous. Now what do we do? What was I supposed to say? Which way to the Vermeer? Did you recognize that voice? I think it was the man from the post office. What man? Calder asked. The guy who stepped on Mrs. Sharp's letter. Well, whoever he is, we could have just kept going. If we didn't stick out before, we sure do now. This was the closest they had come to a fight. Petra's elbows were sore, and she was mad at herself. She knew Calder was right. After all, the man might be nobody. Wait, Calder said, I have an idea. I think I remember a basement entrance. All right, so we have the image on page 208, and I see one frog at least on the top, like right above the man's head. But this is going to be one that has frogs and pentominoes on it. So again, I'm going to have to, oh, I think I see a pentomino. I was about to put a post-it on there. I think it's on the cross beams right here. Is that a P pentomino? I'm still going to go back, so. Okay. They walked quickly around to the east side of the rambling building. There, miraculously, was a small open door half a flight up behind a walled area. The door was propped open with a dented trash can. Wow! If anyone asks us what we're doing, we'll explain that we're making a plan of the building for school. Calder didn't sound as confident as he was trying to feel. Let's get out paper and pencils so it looks like we're really working on something, added Petra. Armed with materials, they crept closer. It was hard to see in the darkened doorway. They paused outside, listening, then peered around the corner. There was no one in sight. They tiptoed down a long corridor that curved to the left and then to the right. Swinging doors opened into a room with a single light bulb overhead. Once inside, they were faced with 3 possible exits. They picked the one in the middle. Ew! Calder stepped over a nasty pile of garbage that smelled of sour milk and sneakers. Petra kept her mitten over her nose. They were soon in a maze of small passageways. What direction do you suppose we're going in? Calder asked, looking around at the peeling paint. No idea, but I want it to be up, Petra said. They found themselves at a fork. To their relief, one direction led to an iron stairwell. They hurried towards it. On the second floor, a diamond-shaped window looked into a hall. I can't see much. You try. Calder stepped aside. At that moment, a blue sweater flashed by. Both kids ducked, and Petra hit Calder in the nose with her hair clip. Petra, watch what you're doing, will you? Calder forgot to whisper, and the sweater reappeared, pausing for several long seconds on the other side of the door before going on. Calder, that looked just like my dad's sweater. I've got to peek out. What do we say if it's him? He'll ask what we're doing here. I don't know, but I need to see if that's my dad. They went as quietly as they could down the hall, past several offices. When they reached the corner, they saw the man in the blue sweater walking up the stairs to the third floor, carrying a smallish rectangular package. The man was definitely Frank Anderle. Weird, Petra whispered. What would he be doing here? He sometimes works Saturdays, but on the other side of campus. Petra was remembering her dad's anger that morning and the way he had pounded the table. She also remembered his words, aren't you glad you aren't responsible for saving one of the world's masterpieces from the maniac? The word maniac echoed in a frightening way in her mind. Did he feel that he was responsible? Maybe he had stumbled onto something he shouldn't have, and that was what had made him so grumpy lately. She remembered him muttering the words alone, or had it been alone? Either one was spooky. And then there was talk about 2 mysterious letters, and also what she'd overheard him saying that fall to her mom. Everyone has something to hide. Seeing how miserable Petra looked, Calder patted her on the back. I'm sure he has a good reason for being here. Stashing backpacks and jackets in a window seat, they began exploring the second floor of Delia Dell. During the next half hour, they tapped, they studied, they pressed, they poked, they leaned, they tugged, they opened, they closed. Several closets appeared, walls creaked, but there was no sign of the painting. Petra couldn't concentrate. I just can't imagine what business he'd have in Delia Dell, she said. He'd be wondering the same thing if he saw you. And that package he was carrying was just the right size. And that package he was carrying would, Petra, just read the same thing over again. Petra suddenly felt very tired of suspecting people. First Mrs. Sharp, then Miss Hussey, then both of them, and now her dad? Calder seemed to pick up on her thoughts. Sneaking around and trying to figure people out isn't as much fun as I thought it would be, he said. Looking through one of the windows, he saw her dad and the man from the post office cross the parking lot. Calder, they're together. Petra noticed that her dad's shoulders were hunched and his hands were stuffed in his pockets. He was no longer carrying the package. And that is the end of chapter 22. Yeah, there we go. Awesome. We only have 3 chapters left, so we're pretty close to figuring out who stole the painting and who received the 3 letters and what's really going on with Petra's dad. All right. Have a great week, everyone. Bye.